"You're not invited to the wedding," Mom texted coldly. "Lily's family thinks it's best." I just smiled and replied, "So status matters more than your own son?" Then I pulled the plug on everything, including their wedding deposit. They never had no clue what was about to hit them. I, 28M, stared at my phone screen, reading the text message for the third time. My mother had sent it with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. "You're not invited to the wedding. Lily's family thinks it's best." The wedding she was referring to was my younger sister's, the golden child who could do no wrong in our family's eyes. I'd been expecting this moment for months, ever since Lily announced her engagement to someone from what my parents called a good family. Translation: money and social status that made them feel important. I typed back quickly, my fingers moving with surprising steadiness. "So status matters more than your own son?" The response came within minutes, and it was exactly what I expected. Mom explained that Lily's future in-laws were concerned about appearances and that my presence might create uncomfortable questions. She reminded me that I should understand, given my current circumstances. My current circumstances. That was their polite way of referring to the fact that I'd been laid off from my corporate job 6 months ago and was currently working as a freelance graphic designer, living in a modest apartment instead of the suburban house they thought I should have by now. What they didn't know was that those current circumstances were about to change everything. I smiled as I crafted my response, keeping it simple. "I understand completely." Then I opened my laptop and began making some very important phone calls. The first call was to my contact at Morrison & Associates, the wedding planning company handling Lily's elaborate affair. I'd been the one who recommended them. Actually, back when my sister first got engaged and my parents were scrambling to find someone who could handle their vision of the perfect wedding. What my family didn't realize was that I'd also been the one quietly funding a significant portion of this perfect wedding. The conversation with Morrison was brief and professional. I explained that due to unforeseen circumstances, I needed to withdraw my financial backing from the Henderson-Walsh wedding scheduled for next month. The woman on the other end of the line was understanding but firm about the implications. Without my contribution, the deposit they'd put down would cover maybe half of what they'd planned. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the band. Everything would need to be scaled back dramatically or canceled entirely. My second call was to Uncle Richard, my father's brother who owned the vineyard where they'd planned to hold the reception. Richard had always been the black sheep of the family, running his small winery while Dad climbed the corporate ladder. We'd grown closer over the years, especially after I started helping him with his marketing materials. Richard listened as I explained the situation, and I could hear him chuckling on the other end. He told me he'd received the booking through Dad, who'd mentioned it was a family favor, but had never actually confirmed the details or put down a deposit. Richard said he'd be happy to let them know the venue was no longer available. The third call was the most satisfying. I contacted the photographer they'd hired, a talented woman I'd worked with on several projects and had recommended to Lily. She was a friend, and when I explained what had happened, she was more than happy to suddenly discover a scheduling conflict for their wedding date. By the time I finished my calls, I felt a strange sense of calm. For years, I've been the family member who quietly made things happen behind the scenes. I'd helped Dad with his presentations, designed marketing materials for Mom's small business, and had even ghostwritten Lily's college application essays. But I'd always been treated as the family disappointment, the one who couldn't quite measure up to their expectations. The next morning, my phone started ringing. It was Mom, and her voice had lost all of its previous coldness. She wanted to know if I'd heard from Morrison & Associates, because they'd called with some concerning news about the wedding budget. I told her I hadn't heard anything, which was technically true. They'd called her, not me. Then Dad called. The vineyard had apparently contacted him about some confusion regarding their booking. Uncle Richard had mentioned something about needing a confirmed deposit and proper contracts, which Dad seemed to think I might know something about since I'd done work for Richard before. I explained to Dad that Uncle Richard ran a business, not a charity, and that family connections only went so far when it came to actual bookings. Dad seemed frustrated but didn't press the issue. Lily called that afternoon, and for the first time in months, she actually sounded like she needed something from me. The photographer had canceled, and she was wondering if I knew anyone else who might be available on such short notice. I told her I'd ask around, but that most good photographers were booked months in advance. Over the next few days, I watched as my family's perfect wedding began to unravel. Mom called twice more, asking if I had any connections in the event planning industry. Dad reached out to see if I knew any other venues that might be available. Lily even sent me a text asking if I could help design new invitations, since they were having to change so many details. Each time, I was helpful but not too helpful. I made suggestions that led nowhere, provided contacts who were conveniently unavailable, and offered assistance that somehow never quite materialized into actual solutions. The breaking point came exactly 1 week after that first text message. Mom called me, and this time her voice was different. She sounded tired, maybe even a little desperate. She explained that they were having trouble with the wedding planning, and she wondered if we could meet for coffee to discuss it. When we met at the small cafe near my apartment, Mom looked older than I remembered. She ordered her usual latte and spent several minutes stirring it before finally speaking. She told me that Lily's wedding was falling apart. The venue had fallen through, the photographer had canceled, and the wedding planner was suggesting they postpone everything by at least 6 months. Lily was devastated, and her fiancé's family was starting to ask uncomfortable questions about our family's ability to deliver on their promises. Mom looked across the table at me and asked if there was anything I could do to help. She mentioned that I seemed to know people in all the right industries, and that maybe I could pull some strings or call in some favors. I sipped my coffee and considered her request carefully. Then I asked her a simple question. Did she think I was good enough to be part of this family or not? Mom looked confused, so I clarified. I reminded her about the text message, about how Lily's future in-laws thought my presence would create uncomfortable questions, and about how she'd agreed that status mattered more than family. I watched as understanding dawned in her eyes. She started to speak, probably to explain or justify or make excuses, but I held up my hand. I told her that I'd spent years being the family member who made things happen quietly in the background. I'd helped everyone with their projects, their problems, their dreams, but I'd never been given credit or recognition. I'd been treated like the family disappointment while secretly being the one who enabled everyone else's successes. Mom tried to interrupt, but I continued. I explained that when she sent that text message, she'd made it clear that I wasn't really part of this family. I was just someone they tolerated when they needed something. Then I told her the truth about the wedding. I explained about my calls to Morrison and Associates, about my conversation with Uncle Richard, about my relationship with the photographer. I watched as her face went through a series of expressions, confusion, realization, and finally something that might have been respect. Mom asked me why I'd done it, and I told her it was simple. If I wasn't good enough to be invited to the wedding, then I wasn't going to be the one making it possible. She sat quietly for a long moment, then asked what it would take for me to undo what I'd done. I smiled and told her it was too late for that. The vendors had moved on to other clients. The venue had been booked by someone else, and the photographer had committed to another event. But I said there might be a way to salvage something, if they were willing to be realistic about their expectations and their budget. More importantly, I told her they needed to decide whether they wanted me as part of this family or not. Not just when they needed something, but actually part of the family. Mom nodded slowly and asked what that would look like. I explained that it would mean treating me with the same respect they showed Lily. It would mean acknowledging the contributions I'd made over the years instead of treating them as expected obligations. And it would mean that when Lily's future in-laws expressed concerns about appearances, the family would stand together instead of throwing me under the bus. Mom was quiet for another long moment. Then she asked if I would help them plan a smaller, more intimate wedding if she could guarantee that things would be different going forward. I told her I'd consider it, but that action spoke louder than words. That evening, I got a call from Dad. He apologized for the way they'd handled the situation and asked if we could start over. He admitted that they'd been so focused on impressing Lily's future in-laws that they'd lost sight of what really mattered. Lily called the next day. She was crying as she told me how sorry she was and how she'd never wanted me excluded from her wedding. She explained that she'd been so caught up in the planning and the pressure from her fiancé's family that she'd let other people make decisions that should have been hers to make. I listened to each of them, and I could hear something in their voices that hadn't been there before. It sounded like respect, maybe even a little fear of what I was capable of when pushed too far. Update 1. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in my parents' living room, helping plan what Lily was now calling her real wedding. Instead of the elaborate affair they'd originally envisioned, we were organizing something smaller and more personal. The venue was Uncle Richard's vineyard after all, but this time with a proper contract and a reasonable fee. The photographer was a talented newcomer I'd met through my freelance work, someone who was eager to build her portfolio and charged a fraction of what the original photographer would have cost. Most importantly, I was not only invited but was being asked to officiate the ceremony. Lily had asked me specifically, saying she couldn't imagine anyone else doing it. The guest list had been cut from 200 to 75, focusing on people who actually mattered to Lily and her fiancé rather than business connections and social obligations. Her future in-laws had initially been resistant to the changes, but when they realized the alternative was no wedding at all, they'd become surprisingly cooperative. As I worked with my family on the new plans, I noticed something interesting. They were asking for my opinion on things, actually listening to my suggestions, and treating me like my input mattered. It was a strange feeling after years of being taken for granted. Update 2. The wedding took place on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in October. The vineyard looked perfect, with golden leaves and soft sunlight filtering through the grapevines. The smaller guest count made everything feel more intimate and meaningful. As I stood before Lily and her fiancé, reading the ceremony I'd written specifically for them, I caught my parents' eyes in the front row. Mom was crying, but she was smiling too. Dad gave me a small nod of approval. During the reception, Lily's father-in-law approached me. He told me he'd heard I was the one who'd helped put everything together, and he was impressed by both the event and my role in making it happen. He mentioned that his company was looking for someone with my skills and asked if I'd be interested in discussing a position. I thanked him for the offer and told him I'd consider it. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same family that had wanted me excluded from the wedding was now trying to recruit me for their business. But the most satisfying moment came during the toasts. Dad stood up and talked about family, about how the people who matter most are the ones who stand by you when things get difficult. He looked directly at me and thanked me for reminding them what family really means. Update 3. 6 months later, my relationship with my family has completely changed. I did end up taking the position with Lily's father-in-law's company, which turned out to be exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been looking for. The pay is excellent, the work is challenging, and I finally feel like I'm being recognized for my abilities. More importantly, my family now treats me as an equal rather than as someone they can take for granted. When they need help with something, they ask politely and offer fair compensation. When they make plans, I'm included from the beginning rather than as an afterthought. Lily and I have grown closer than we've ever been. She often tells people that I saved her wedding, but I think what really happened is that I saved our family. By forcing them to confront how they'd been treating me, I made them realize what they were in danger of losing. Mom still brings up that text message sometimes, usually when she's had a glass of wine. She says it was the worst mistake she ever made, but that she's grateful it led to where we are now. I've learned something important through all of this. Sometimes the people who love you need to be reminded that love isn't just about being there when it's convenient. It's about choosing to value someone even when it's difficult or inconvenient. The wedding deposit I pulled might have cost them their perfect day, but it gave us something much more valuable, a real family relationship built on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. And every time I look at the photos from Lily's wedding, I'm reminded that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be taken for granted anymore.